I would like to thank you for taking the time to watch this short video. It is a 15-minute introduction into my dissertation, and really all it's going to get through in the 15 minutes is the purpose and the reason behind why I believe this topic is so important and important enough to become a dissertation. The title of my dissertation is Power and the Illegitimate Leader, a Guide for the Social Equity Activist. My goal is to, through the whole dissertation, to get through all of these points here. For this 15-minute introduction, we're going to get as far as the research questions. Because my doctoral degree is in public administration, my dissertation starts with the Middlebrook Conference, which took place, the original Middlebrook I Conference, which took place in 1968. The consensus that came out of Middlebrook I became the foundation for a era in public administration known as New Public Administration. Several authors have written about New Public Administration over the years, and my argument in my dissertation is that we took a wrong turn and when we left New Public Administration as a desirable goal, and started wandering in the wilderness for several decades. New Public Administration is now seen as, and Shafritz and Russell write about it in 2002, as an academic advocacy movement for social equity, and it called for a proactive administrator, which is something of a departure from up until the 1960s, when the public administrator was supposed to be seen as neutral. Where my dissertation starts, because I'm a fan of John Rawls' theory of justice, social equity, I see social equity as a struggle between equality and liberty. In the United States, we've always seemed to err, in my opinion, on the side of too much liberty, because if you are, if the structural dynamics are stacked against you, then you don't have the same advantage as other individuals when the struggle is fought on this side of excessive liberty. And so in the 1960s, things were happening. And writers in public administration, specifically those who met at Middlebrook, were saying, you know what, we're taking a wrong turn. And in 1968 we elected Nixon. And so I ask in my dissertation, were there some structural dynamics that elected Nixon? It's gratifying to know that others have come along on this thinking as well, because Thomas Piketty's new book, which is now sold out on Amazon and still remains at the top of the charts as I film this, Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, also has a trend line which is the exact opposite of mine. And so were there structural dynamics that altered global monetary policies that advantaged the rich? And this is what Thomas Piketty's thesis is about. And so if we're going to take on the problem of structural dynamics in public administration, we need to ask, as George Fredrickson wrote, for whom is a program effective or good? And Thomas Piketty has argued very effectively that it was good for the extremely wealthy. And for Osmond, in his foundational piece for public administration, asks, can we go home? Back to that third period when government did great things. Why was it allowed to change? What structural dynamics prevented public administration from continuing on what was started at the Middlebrook Conference, Middlebrook I? So this problem of social equity from a public administration perspective is a problem that we started nibbling at under LBJ's Great Society programs. He saw, and we in the United States saw this as a problem that we could fix. And so they started nibbling around at this problem of social equity, and the Middlebrook Conference idea said, you know what, let's blow it wide open. Let's really take this on and have public administration carry the torch for this battle against social inequity. And Dr. Frosman, in his piece, writes about how we, for 3 decades, wandered around with this proliferation of eclectic choices, many of them unsuited for organizational effectiveness, and all at the expense, we pursued those goals, all at the expense of alternative organizational choices and broad-based public interests. And so he asks at the end of this article, which was the conclusion of this symposium, can we go home now? And so that's what I ask as well. So if this problem of social equity is still there, and we've been nibbling around at the sides of it, especially with all of this eclectic choice of programs which we've tried in public administration, why have we not been able to get to the core of the problem? Why do we only just nibble around at the outside edge? Well, I argue in my dissertation that it's because there's this invisible barrier that we all hit as we strive to get to the core of what is causing social inequality. And so what kind of an institution? I argue that it is an institution that is creating this invisible barrier. Susan Gooden argues very forcefully in her new book, Race and Social Equity, that racism is the institution, the structural dynamics that are keeping us from getting to the core of the problem. Ernest Becker started arguing in 1973, as others have since then in cultural anthropology and social psychology, that terror management theory is at the core of this because it drives religious fundamentalism. And the problem with religious fundamentalism as a structural dynamic is that they can claim First Amendment protection against anybody attacking them, and this is what Schatznider calls the privatization of conflict. We can't talk about this as a public institution in public administration. We have to privatize this conflict because you can't penetrate the religious freedom, our First Amendment freedoms. So that's a structural dynamic, and hegemony has always been around, and Antonio Gramsci captured this very well writing in prison. And so when we look at racism and hegemony and religious fundamentalism as what they have in common, we see bias. The structural dynamics that I argue in my dissertation are structural dynamics of bias as a social construct. So when we see bias as a social construct, specifically in two very important ways, which is how I deal with bias in my dissertation. Bias when it is cast and mobilized against individuals to cast them as undeserving, and bias when it is mobilized to cast individuals and groups as deviant. So the lazy, the criminals, the lazy people, the criminals, the non-Christians, they're just not deserving because they're not as good as us. They're not trying hard enough, or they're pursuing different goals, and so they're just not deserving because they're not doing it the right way. The deviant are even worse. The gays, the lesbians, the transgendered, even atheists are seen as deviant because how can anybody live properly if they don't have a belief in God? And other people who just don't want to conform, the hippies in the 1960s and feminists, they're bad, they're toxic for society if we follow these individuals. Who constructs bias? If it is a social construct, how is it constructed? Can it be deconstructed? And if it can't, and this is where I go with my dissertation, can it be displaced? When we see bias, let's try and displace it. What can we do to displace it? So my purpose statement for my dissertation talks about how if we're going to combat the problem of power within public administration, which is susceptible to being abused, is public administration guilty, and I argue that it has been, guilty of the mobilization of bias, facilitating it, or at least being complicit in allowing it to happen. So to resolve this problem, I propose that we get involved in training social equity activists and street-level bureaucrats and other social entrepreneurs in how to identify these structural dynamics. It's very important to understand the structural dynamics because once we recognize them, we can start to displace them. And then I argue to improve the effectiveness of these individuals, we can provide them with an information communication technology. I call it an institutional memory in my dissertation, so that they have this platform from which they can engineer narrative threads to actually displace bias when it is harmful and attacking a vulnerable population. And then finally, I want to train these individuals so that they become transformational leaders. But in order to become transformational leaders, they need to have some kind of an institution that they can self-affiliate with. And I argue that it can be a global organization. It does not have to be constricted by region. It does not have to be constricted by geography. It does not have to be constricted by political affiliation. It can be a truly global organization. And that way, when we have protest movements like the Occupy movement, where on one weekend in 2011 there were 951 cities in 82 countries. These protesters could become affiliated as a new institution, a single institution, with sharing a single institutional memory, so that they can become more powerful in transforming their protest narratives into governing narratives. I argue that when power mobilizes bias, that makes the power illegitimate. And that's very important because in the American state legislatures, I argue that they are literally hotbeds of illegitimate power. Look at what some state legislatures have done. In the history of the United States, they have put together the Jim Crow South. They have been involved in gerrymandering and altering and restricting voting rights. That continues today. We have the 21st century style of legislatures that we've seen in Arizona. They're mobilizing bias against individuals on a regular basis, making abortions more difficult, legal abortions more difficult to obtain, passing a law which allows public institutions to refuse service to people just based on religious beliefs, and also the anti-immigration laws, which Arizona was famous for. And now we've seen those kind of legislatures spreading across the South, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Missouri. These state legislatures have been manipulated in a way that I believe their power is illegitimate. And so what I propose is a mechanism where we can actually devolve that power down to the local level so that the social equity activist becomes much more effective. So that's the dependent variable in my dissertation. The power to mobilize bias is the independent variable. My intervening variables are the perceived legitimacy of this power. What makes people think that these state legislatures have legitimacy to pass these kind of laws so that they get reelected again? Because if they're getting reelected, it legitimizes their power. But what they do is they get reelected and then they mobilize bias against already marginalized and vulnerable populations. So the functionality of representative democracy is my other intervening variable. So this is my research model. I go through a series of 6 hypotheses in an inductive sequence so that we can, at the end of the day, talk about what Schatznyder talks about. The most legitimate question to be asked in a democracy is, how can people get control of the government? And the inductive sequence of my 6 hypotheses ends up with a proposal for winning elections and creating and bringing about transformational policy change. So by the time I finish and conclude my dissertation, I have I've substituted 2 proxies, which make it much easier for me to operationalize my research. Instead of the power to mobilize bias, I have substituted in this degree of worldview threat that a population is vulnerable to. And this, for my first intervening variable about the legitimacy of power, I've used a proxy that gets into the tangible and emotional cost of shunning, because that's what gives people the perception of legitimacy. Is if somebody has enough power that they can shun you and throw you out of their society, out of their community, that comes at a very high emotional and financial cost. And so if they have that kind of leverage over you, then their power is perceived to be legitimate, and it becomes very important that the social equity activists displace that. And that's why I've put a proxy in for my intervening variable. And I've added a third intervening variable, a 4th variable, the availability of a proper training. And because that's what my dissertation really gets into, is the idea that we need to train these social equity activists so that they're no longer social equity activists, but they're effective transformational leaders. And that's the ultimate goal for my dissertation, is to operationalize this diagrammatic model. Thank you for your time, and I hope you take the time to watch much more detailed videos, which I will be posting and keeping updated on a regular basis at this point. Thank you.